I love Fire Emblem. If you're watching my channel, you probably love Fire Emblem too, or at the very least have a complicated relationship with it. And if that's the case, then you probably know that the creator of Fire Emblem was a man named Kaga. You might even know that he only directed the first 5 Fire Emblem games before he left Nintendo due to creative differences. And if you're as entrenched into online Fire Emblem culture as I am, then you probably know that those creative differences resulted in him creating a game that is basically Fire Emblem with the serial numbers filed off. Ring Saga Champions of Utona, otherwise known as Ring Saga. Now, Kaga has a reputation for being a little bit weird, a little bit goofy, adding some strange things to his video games. Things like the Pursuit modifier, Thracia Escape, Thracia Fog of War, Adept on a Bolting Boss, Infinite Range Warp, Movement Stars, and Caesar's entire stat line. But if you thought the things in old school Fire Emblem were goofy, you ain't seen nothing yet. Ring Saga has some of the more bizarre gameplay choices I have ever seen in a Fire Emblem game, and I will continue to refer to this as a Fire Emblem game, because it is a Fire Emblem game. You move around on a grid, you do the Fire Emblem combat, it's got low numbers, it's got all the Fire Emblem stuff. It even has skills like Astra, Soul, and Luna. They just have weird names. There's Anna in this game, it's a Fire Emblem game, okay? This is a Fire Emblem game for the PS1, and it's a weird Fire Emblem game. It has a reputation for being incredibly hard, and it has a reputation for being incredibly good. And I question how much those two reputations are actually earned. Wait. Please don't dislike the video if you're a Ring Saga fan. I'm a Ring Saga fan. I fucking love that game. But I have a very complicated relationship with it, and this video is going to be half review, half me exploring my relationship with a PlayStation game that was never translated to English. So, yeah, let's talk about the first game that the creator of Fire Emblem made after he left Nintendo and Intelligent Systems. I will start by talking about the gameplay of Ring Saga. At its core, it takes the hybridization of FE3 and FE5 as a base, but builds on them with a bunch of weird mechanics. Much like in FE3, you have both a weapons inventory and an items inventory. If you've only played the modern games, you might be more familiar with this as an FE9 feature, but it did originate in Mystery of the Emblem. Also taken from Mystery of the Emblem is dismounting, a feature which forces your mounted units to take a movement and stat penalty in order to go indoors, either on indoor maps or on maps that have indoor portions. Just like in FE3 and Thracia, this will also limit the unit's weapons, but it won't ever force them to use a weapon that they can't use otherwise. The weapon issue is also alleviated by the fact that this game uses the old weapon level system, meaning that weapon level is a stat. For those unfamiliar with what weapon level is, in Fire Emblems 1 and 3, weapon level was a stat just like speed, strength, defense, etc. You had a base weapon level and a percentage chance for your weapon level to grow on each level up. For classes that use multiple weapon types, such as Cavaliers using swords and lances, this means that your weapon level will allow you to use better swords and better lances. Each weapon has a weapon level associated with it, rather than a lettered rank. And as long as your weapon level matches, you can use it. Just like other stats, weapon level does have stat boosters associated with it, so if you get a unit who has a really bad weapon level, you can use a stat booster in order to buff them up to the point where they can use better weapons. The most prominent feature taken from the Judd Girl games is the addition of skills, and they sort of merge some of the features of FE4 skills and FE5 skills. From FE4, they take the idea of personal skills and class skills. meaning that there are sometimes skills associated with a specific class. Whether a skill is personal or just associated with the class you're in is usually not relevant, but it does mean that sometimes promoting into specific classes will give you a new skill. And also, there is a Zane-esque unit who can transform into your other units, but he will only acquire their class skills, not their personal ones. The way that he works is really complicated, and I'll get into that later because I do want to finish talking about skills. Editing Danny, interrupting here. I actually forgot to follow up talking about the Zane clone, so I'll just insert that here. Basically, he just reclasses. He doesn't copy stats, he just reclasses. This was probably intended as a nerf, but since there's a playable witch, he can get the rewarp skill, and yeah, he's definitely better than Zane. Okay, throwing it back to past Danny to tell you about skills. Since Ring Saga has a lot more to skills than FE4 and even FE5. In addition to the skills that you start with or get through promoting to a different class, you can acquire skills in a variety of different ways. The simplest one is by using skill books or skill scrolls in order to give yourself a new skill. This is something that is lifted straight from Thracia. However, you can also get skills by visiting certain houses, where someone will offer to train one of your units in a new skill, oftentimes but not always asking for a gold fee to do so. However, the most common way in which units acquire new skills is through level up. Each unit has a series of level up skills associated with specific levels. For example, one of the two main lords, Runan, starts with the skill Urbanite, but at level 7 he learns Adept, at level 15 he learns Draco, and at level 35 he learns Nihil. Additionally, he will get Adept and Charisma on promotion if he doesn't have Adept, but it is pretty unlikely that he doesn't have Adept by the time he promotes. In many ways, these level up skills are what defines units much more than their base stats and growth rates. Additionally, almost every unit in the game has some special quality about them. Usually this is in the form of a special event or a personal weapon, but sometimes it is a defining skill or class. For example, Naren is the only unit in the game who can access Gold Paladin, whereas Raffen has a special event that allows him to transition from Bronze Paladin to Wyvern. While some of these events are definitely cryptic enough to be considered secret events, the majority of them are actually signaled surprisingly well for a Kaga game. For example, there is a character who has betrayed two of the playable units in your army. If you have one of them kill him, then you get a special sword out of it. This is something that rewards you for paying attention to the game. On the other hand, there definitely is some amount of Kaga crypticness. For example, if you don't deploy Julia in Chapter 4, there's a very powerful recruitable unit who just doesn't spawn. Since he doesn't spawn if you don't deploy her, there's nothing to indicate that you're missing out on anything. So if you don't think she's a particularly compelling unit, then you have the potential to miss out on an even stronger one. That being said, there's no shortage of busted units. Exploring incredibly creative ideas such as a personal weapon that gives you casual mode, a personal tome that hits all enemies on the map but can only be used on turns divisible by 5, the Flurry skill which allows you to engage in 5 rounds of combat in a row, and a variety of other broken things that define the units in your army. It's a very cool approach to unit design, and it makes everyone stand out from each other. In traditional Fire Emblem, even with skills, oftentimes units of the same class or relatively the same stat lines end up blending together. But Ring Saga makes them all stand apart. Even the really bad units have something unique to them, such as a late game unit who has a 10% movement growth, but also a 10% strength growth and really bad base stats. There are 2 more general gameplay features I want to go over before I dive in depth into the structure of the campaign. The first is the way that magic and resistance work. It's very similar to Thracia, which had magic and resistance as a single stat. But in Ring Saga, your resistance is equal to half of your magic stat. You can supplement this or your physical defense by equipping shields, but they have limited durability, and as a result, mages often feel quite threatening because they will hit on one of your weaker defensive stats. Physical units do not tend to have good magic stats because, they're physical units, and so as a result, they have even worse resistance stats. This does have the side effect of making Pegasus Knights have decent magic stats, and therefore very good users of the Levin Sword, but I think that that's a cool trade-off. The other mechanic that I want to talk about is level up and promotion. The overall level cap in Ring Saga is 40, but it's not quite 40, it's weird. So your units that are unpromoted start out with a level cap of 20. However, when you promote them, they gain plus 20 to whatever their current level is, and that becomes their level cap. So if you promote an unpromoted unit at level 14, then their new level cap becomes 34. If you wait until 20 to promote them, then their new level cap becomes 40. On the other hand, pre-promoted units start out with a level cap of 30. Now, there are items that are kind of equivalent to Eternal Seals from the Fates games that you can use to add 10 to your level cap, but you can't use them to exceed 40. You can only use them to bring yourself up from 30 or 24 or whatever your level cap is at the moment. It is also worth noting you can use these on unpromoted units in order to increase their unpromoted level cap, which I think is pretty neat, especially because oftentimes Pegasus Knights don't actually want to promote, both because their promotion item is rare and because they lose speed and magic on promotion, making them worse at Levin Sword use. And yes, I did say their promotion item, implying class-based promotion items. Just like in Arcanea, just like in GBA, you have Knight Crests, you have Hero Crests, you have whatever matches a specific class, you need to use that promotion item. Now, there are a bunch of other obscure mechanics in Ring Saga, such as weapons tracking kills and the way that smith hammers work and cursed weapons, and all sorts of weird things that don't come up in most playthroughs, so this is by no means a comprehensive list of the mechanics. But I do think it goes over the most fundamental ones to the gameplay, and as a result, I feel satisfied moving on to the campaign structure. The structure of Ring Saga's campaign is fairly unique, and to my mind, one of the main appeals to playing it. It's essentially broken up into 4 distinct sections. The first one is the Island of Veld, which is functionally an 8-chapter-long prologue to the main campaign. Its events are mostly divorced from the main story, and serves as an introduction to the unique mechanics of TRS as well as a large number of your units. However, upon leaving the island, we are introduced to the game's main gimmick, the army split system. You see, the game's 2 main lords, Holmes and Renan, go on separate campaigns from each other, similarly to Alm and Celica. However, unlike the Valentian lovers, the heroes of Ring Saga do not have set armies. Instead, you divide all of the units you've recruited into 2 separate armies, one that goes with Renan and one that goes with Holmes, in a similar manner to Part 4 of Radiant Dawn, only without all of the tedious route maps. There are 3 separate reunions between the 2 armies where you can redistribute units, items, and gold, and the sections between these units are usually referred to by the community as Split 1, Split 2, and Split 3. The general consensus is that Renan has harder maps than Holmes and has many more outdoor maps, whereas Holmes has a more even split between indoor and outdoor maps, usually with a focus on utility and combat being a secondary trait. Additionally, Renan's campaign is structured like a traditional Fire Emblem, moving from one map to the next with no diversions, whereas Holmes is navigating a Gaiden-esque map. He can travel back and forth to wherever he wants, visit shops from earlier in the game, and even get into skirmishes to train up units. The game suggests that you send your weaker forces with Holmes so that he can train them up, and send your stronger forces with Renan since there's not going to be time for training. I'm a big fan of this structure, as it both adds variety to repeat playthroughs and challenges you to split your army up in such a way that you have appropriate resources for both lords. For example, while it's true that Renan has most of the outdoor maps, it's not like Holmes has 0 outdoor maps, so if you send all of your cavalry with Renan, Holmes is going to struggle a bit on his outdoor maps. Deciding how much gold each army wants, and which healers or mages go with which lord is also theoretically interesting. And of course, you want to pair people with units that they support, especially if you're using both of them. However, you may have noticed that I threw around the phrase "in theory" a few times, and that's because as wonderful as the army split structure is, I think that the way secret events function in Ring Saga gets in the way. You see, most units in Ring Saga have some sort of special event, and oftentimes those events are route exclusive. Some units will have different events on different routes. For example, the Wind Mage Maruju has an event on Holmes' route that gives him a special tome that anyone can use, not just him, and an event on Renan's route that gives a growth booster, once again that anyone can use, not just him. However, for the majority of units, there is either only one route that gives their special event, or the two different events are so unbalanced that they functionally only have one route that they want to go on. For the experienced player, this means that they're often not actually making meaningful decisions when dividing the army up. But for the blind player, it could mean missing an otherwise telegraphed event. For example, if you send Roger and Mel with Holmes on Split 1, then he will return to the Isle of Veld. Earlier in the story, it is hinted at that Mel ran away from Mars Temple, and now that she has the opportunity to go back, if she chooses to do so, she will get her personal staff, the Ensorcel, which is a huge part of her kit, and one of the more powerful personal staffs in the game, in my opinion. However, when you're splitting your army up, there's no indication that Holmes plans to return to Veld. So if you decided to send her and her fiancé with Renan, thinking their horses would be valuable in his campaign, you just miss out on her personal staff. Now, for some of these secrets, it's not a huge deal, as you're just missing out on something like support bonuses, but for others it can be quite frustrating, such as potentially missing out on your only warp staff or the aforementioned global nuke tome. This problem is exacerbated by the way that the game handles its final portion, aka Split 3. You see, the majority of Ring Saga is actually quite easy, especially in comparison to modern Fire Emblem games. It's possible to use some pretty meme-tastic units and still have success with relatively little effort. And I don't say that as a bad thing. I honestly think that the lack of difficulty is one of Ring Saga's strengths because of how much it allows you to use some of the sillier units in the game. If the game was too hard for you to make scrubs like Norton, Arcus, and Garrow work, then it would lose a lot of its appeal in my mind. But towards the end of Split 2, the game starts to ramp up in difficulty. Well, difficulty isn't exactly the right term. I would call this more of a frustration spike. The first map that really comes to mind as a frustration spike is the desert map with 5 Wyvern Knight bosses, all of whom support each other. If they are in support range, they get massive boosts to their hit, crit, and avoid, making them very difficult to take down. They can be somewhat circumvented through a route choice mechanic, but this is harder than it would appear and also only the beginning of a course of absolute nightmare levels. Because next up is a map that you've probably heard of, the Invisible Ballistician Hell. This is a siege map composed almost entirely of invisible ballisticians and meteor mages, none of whom you can attack because they are invisible. There is a force-deployed squishy game over condition on this map, as well as an additional recruitable unit who is squishy, and you have to deploy the shitty early game Cavalier to recruit her, so you probably have 3 very delicate units in a map full of invisible long-range enemies. But would you believe me if I told you that what I am describing is the A route on an A versus B situation where the B route is considered to be worse? And I don't mean just considered to be worse by me, like universally people consider the B route to be worse. Because not only does it have all of the invisible ballisticians and meteor mages from the first map, but it's also indoor and you have to deal with one of your units betraying you, but becoming a soldier with no indication that that soldier is the unit who betrayed you in order to re-recruit him, and it's just so frustrating. Continuing the Hell Tour, we have a swamp map that lowers grounded units' movement as well as damaging them every turn, and the damage increases over time. A map full of infinite reinforcements, including flyers and ballisticians that start on turn 1. 2 of the biggest stat creep bosses in the series history, relative to the strength of other units in the game, of course. And an indoor map with a literal 5x5 block of Draco zombies. Now, believe it or not, the only one of these maps that I actually think is genuinely unfair with the tools the game gives you is the Invisible Ballisticians one. but all of the others can be cheesed pretty reliably and oftentimes with multiple setups. For example, you could warp skip to not have to deal with the Draco zombie block, or you could wait until turn 5 and then launch the global nuke, which actually deals effective damage to monsters, including the Draco zombies, and will kill all but one of them, since one of them is invincible for plot reasons until later in the map. The problem that I have, however, is that many of the tools needed for these cheese setups are locked behind secret events, and if you want to play these maps quote-unquote honestly, you're gonna have a bad time. Moreover, even if you do get all of the secret events, if you just send the wrong units down the wrong route split, then you could end up SOL anyway. For example, in my first playthrough, I sent the Chukonu, which is a 4x Brave Bow, with Holmes, because Holmes is a bow lord, and I thought that would be useful. Unfortunately, the Chukonu is one of the key strategies in a cheese for killing Julius, who is an incredibly hard boss in Runan route. For this reason, I would definitely recommend saving before every route split, but even then, I do think it is frustrating to have to replay 6 or 7 maps just because you realize partway through a split that you sent someone with the wrong army. The ideal solution is probably just to look up a split guide for each split. There's a good one on WOD that goes over what events for each unit are on each route and recommends which route they would send each unit, and I generally think their recommendations are actually solid. But I also don't think that the existence of these guides should be a reason for us to give Kaga slack. I mean, he should design the game as if people are playing it without access to a guide, since most people play games that way. I think that this, in combination with the incredibly trolly nature of things like invisible ballistas, could easily be described as player hostile. I know last time I used that term, a lot of people got upset, but it really isn't a moral judgment. It just means that as a developer, you're placing yourself in an adversarial relationship with your player base. And believe it or not, there are people who seek this type of design philosophy. But I do think that when leaning into that adversarial relationship, developers risk turning away large swaths of their potential audience. And that's a shame, because I think Ring Saga has a lot to offer people who aren't into these super trolly design philosophies. Speaking from personal experience, I quit on the chapter with a 5x5 block of Draco zombies, but less than a week later I came back, started from chapter 1, used a split guide, and ended up having a blast. The gameplay is easy, but it's very satisfying making use of all of these creative ideas. And the story is really complicated, but generally pretty engaging. The presentation is a little bit sloppy, as it suffers from many large lore dumps, but the politics are more complicated than Fire Emblem often allows it to be. That being said, I've mentioned the story, and I've mentioned that I don't think being player hostile is a moral failure, but it is worth noting that there are aspects of this story that I would consider to be moral failings on Shozu Kaga's part. So it's time to dive into the story of Ring Saga. Hey, I do want to give a couple of huge content warnings around sexism and racism. More specifically, blackface, messed up blood stuff, the sexualization of minors, drugging someone's drink, sex slavery, and, of course, mind control. If any of these topics are too heavy for you right now or just in general, feel free to give this section a skip and just know that they are all present and oftentimes very front and center in Ring Saga's story, so maybe skip the story as well. In its broad strokes, the plot of Ring Saga is very similar to a lot of Fire Emblem plots. There's an evil empire, and they're working in concert with a dark cult. After our young hero's dad dies, he's able to accept his responsibility as a leader, unite with a lost princess, and the two of them team up to defeat God and /Aura Dragon. However, the way in which Ring Saga tries to differentiate itself from those plots is by showing us the general sliminess of most people in the ruling class. The game begins with our hero Runan arriving in the island nation of Welt, searching for allies. However, he finds that one of the island's elite ministers has taken advantage of the king's absence and ongoing war in order to stage a power play. He consolidates his power by pretending to be acting on behalf of the queen, and imprisoning any who speak up against him. But despite the fact that allegedly Welt is one of the good guy nations, he hardly faces any pushback from the other members of the nobility. During the course of the prologue, Renan is able to resolve Welt's conflict, overthrowing Coda and placing Merlin in charge. And while Merlin is presented as more noble and loyal to the king even in his absence, he's also much less effective at ruling the island than Coda. In fact, as soon as Renan leaves, brigands take over multiple portions of the island, and Holmes has to go back and deal with them. This already is a little bit more thought than Fire Emblem typically gives to good guy, bad guy, but once we reach the mainland, we get introduced to even more shades of grey. We are quickly introduced to the character of Richard, who allies himself with Renan and Holmes, but is also primarily concerned only with his own interests, specifically achieving more status and power, and to this end he ends up manipulating Princess Tia into marriage. We end up killing some people shortly before peace talks who are only fighting merely because they wish not to be at a severe disadvantage when it comes to the peace negotiations. We spend a lot of time with Holmes, who, even though he does end up fighting against pirates, brigands, evil empire, and cultists, is doing most of it in order to loot money and ancient artifacts. We are asked to question the truth behind the mythology that everyone on the continent has been taught, and potentially even sympathize with the Dark Cult, as many of their actions are in response to centuries of persecution, torture, imprisonment, and general colonial violence. But this right here is where we start running into our first problems. I know a lot of people in the community are a huge fan of Kaga's work, and there's no real easy way to say this, so I'm just gonna rip the band-aid off. Shozu Kaga is an out-and-out racist. In addition to having some questionable stuff in his games, he's made racist comments about real-world people in some of the few interviews we have with him. I know a lot of the community loves to idolize him because of his frankly absurd and kind of ingenious game design tenets, but at the end of the day, being able to make good games doesn't necessarily equate to being a good person. And a lot of Kaga's more messed up beliefs are on display in this story. There's a lot of emphasis on bloodlines, which is generally a red flag when it comes to race stuff anyway, but especially when it comes to the topic of indigenous peoples. And make no mistake, this is a story about colonialists and indigenous peoples. When we learn about the secret history of this game setting Liberia, we discover that the Zoans are actually the only native peoples, with all of the other races being settlers who came from across the sea. The Zoans were initially worshippers of the dark god Grexel, and when they were threatened by settler colonialists, they summoned their dark god and established an evil empire that eventually was overthrown, resulting in them all getting imprisoned in a tower. They spend a long time being tortured as slaves before one of them is able to summon the dark god again, attempting to re-establish the Zoan empire, before eventually being overthrown by Renan and Holmes. Yeah, this story is very icky. It has a lot of parallels to the real-world genocide of indigenous American peoples, up to and including the whitewashing of history to allow the settler colonialists to pretend that this land was always theirs. But, making the native peoples who were colonized and are explicitly persecuted for their blood into devil worshippers is disgusting. It echoes the very arguments that were used both then and now to justify said genocide. But in case you're willing to give Kaga the benefit of the doubt that this is simply an unfortunate coincidence, don't worry, because the blackface scene is definitely racist. You see, there's a thief who joins in Chapter 8 named Junie, and she is the only person of color in the entire game. I actually really like her character. She's incredibly silly and standoffish and charming, and hey, it was nice to see a black person in Fire Emblem this early on. I guess Kaga really did do it first, but he also did blackface first, because it turns out if you get her paired ending with another character, she reveals that actually she's white. And the reason that she looks black is because she's had dirt on her face this whole time, because she rubbed dirt all over herself to make herself look ugly. But now that she has a boyfriend, she knows that she deserves to be beautiful. Oh boy, there is a lot to unpack there. I hope I don't have to explain why it's offensive to have your only black character be revealed in a post-credits scene to have been doing blackface the whole time. And not only that, but the blackface is quite literally dirt. Intelligent Systems' slate isn't exactly clean, with Devdon being modeled after a minstrel show, but This is probably still the most racist thing I've seen in video games. I don't think there's any excuse for its inclusion. There is obviously a very complicated conversation to be had about things like separating the art from the artist and separating the gameplay from the story, and different people are going to draw different lines. For myself personally, I still like Ring Saga's gameplay. I still play Ring Saga. I think it is an enjoyable game. But I think that this is an unacceptable thing to include in the story. There were definitely some iffy racial undercurrents in the Judgirl games, but they are on full display in Ring Saga, and I'm not a fan. But if I'm going to criticize the problematic things in Ring Saga, I can't stop with the race stuff, because Kaga also has a lot of sexist content in the story of this game. There is a rather infamous event around the character Plum, who is a teenager who is drugged using something equivalent to rohypnol. She is then shipped off into sex slavery. A lot of people really don't like this event, but personally, at least the first half of it doesn't bother me that badly. It's definitely serious, but it's played for drama, and it's not presented as a good thing. I think the biggest issue that people take with it is that you, the player, have to send Plum into the house where she gets drugged. And I can totally understand why someone would be uncomfortable doing that, especially if they had a history with date rape drugs. But I will say that divorced from Shozo Kaga's misogynist tendencies, I don't have a problem with a story exploring this potentially dark topic as long as it frames it as the serious thing that it is, which is where we run into our problems. Plum disappears from the party for a couple of chapters, and when you're reunited with her, the scene is played for comedy. I once again hope I don't have to explain to my audience why in an otherwise serious game, the comic relief being a child having been drugged into sex slavery is not great. But it gets worse because you encounter this sex slavery scenario again, and regardless of who ends up getting duped by them, it is once again played for comedy. It's funny how these children keep putting on the dancer outfits in the sex slavery ring. This plays into a larger problem with how basically every female character in this story is presented as naive to some extent. With the children, I can understand it, although again, their naivete is no excuse for using that for jokes about sex slavery. But Tia, Entei, and Kate should know better, and yet they are consistently duped by men due to their naivete. Kaga's mind control fetish also rears its ugly head, with yet another princess being mind controlled by the evil cult. I know that's common enough to be a bit of a meme in the Fire Emblem community, but it's worth noting that that plotline isn't exactly normal or common outside of Fire Emblem. And infamously, there is a conversation between two prepubescent girls where they talk about their breast development. Although thankfully this was altered in the fan translation because, yeah, not great. Let me be clear. If you enjoy Ring Saga, that doesn't make you a bad person. I don't think you're racist or sexist if you enjoy the politicking or the deep characters or any of the other praiseworthy aspects of the gameplay and story. I'm not trying to hashtag cancel Ring Saga and Ring Saga fans, but I think it's important to acknowledge the problematic aspects of the media that we enjoy. And I do enjoy Ring Saga, and that enjoyment isn't just limited to its gameplay. I like many of the characters, I like the politicking. I think this is the only game where the Camus archetype actually works, and it works for multiple characters for different reasons. And I even theoretically like the idea of the entire game's foundational mythology being a lie. I just don't like the various racist and sexist things lying under the surface. And I definitely don't like what those things imply about Shozo Kaga's real-world beliefs. But with that heavier topic out of the way, I think it's time for my concluding thoughts. Ring Saga is an incredibly flawed game. From its unclear communication, to its trolly map design, to its problematic story elements, there is a lot to criticize about Ring Saga, and you might come away from this video thinking that I'm not a fan. But I absolutely am. I love this frickin' game. I will rant about its difficulty spikes or its obtuse nature or the frustrating aspects of Kaga's personality that sneak their way into the story. And I will understand and sympathize with anyone for whom those issues are deal breakers. But what I won't say is that any of those individual issues ruin it for me, or heck, even the combined effect of all of them. I started my first Ring Saga playthrough less than a year ago. I proceeded to rage quit 4 chapters from the ending, and then a week later, started back over, played through it to the end, and then a week after that, started over, played through it to the end, and now I'm working my way through the game on 0% growths. I can't get enough of this game. If you are a fan of Fire Emblem, I highly recommend you at the very least try out Ring Saga. I think it does a lot of cool things, and while it's absolutely not a game for everyone, I do think it's a game every Fire Emblem player should try. After all, mainline Fire Emblem games are often full of significant flaws, like early game bosses in Shadow Dragon, ambush spawns in Awakening, or the absurd level design and gimmicks of Fire Emblem Fates Revelations. Yet despite these problems, we tolerate at least some of the series on a regular basis. And that's because all of these games, even my below that FE7, have some good features. So we have to take the good with the bad. If you want to enjoy the insane design philosophy of Ring Saga, you kinda gotta bite the bullet and deal with a little bit of too easy difficulty and a little bit too frustrating map design. Well, maybe. Because you see, there is one way in which we can experience the platonic ideal of Fire Emblem. There is one way in which we can get the good aspects of mainline Fire Emblem or even Ring Saga without having to deal with any of the nonsense. And that is, of course, because this video is secretly ROM hack propaganda. You didn't think I stopped, baby. I'm always propagandizing ROM hacks. If you are a fan of Ring Saga who watched this far because you wanted me to gush about your favorite Kaga Saga game, then have I got the recommendation for you. Play Fire Emblem Code of the Burger King by Retina because it takes the wonderful character and unit design of Ring Saga and places it into a game with actually challenging difficulty and, to my mind, some of the most tightly designed maps that I've played. And if that elevator pitch wasn't enough to convince you, then stay tuned next week because we're gonna review Code of the Burger King. Finally, months overdue, but we're doing it. But if you don't want to wait an entire week to see my review of Code of the Burger King, then guess what? It's actually available on my Patreon right now. Yes, early videos are just one of the benefits that come from supporting my channel. Another one is verbal thank yous. So thank you Tailored Muffin, George Granville the 7th PM, SUP, Caius Cole, Gabe the Green, Control Aegis, Joanna the Wrench Witch, Juniper Chungby, Ginger, Autumn Kelsey, Storm, Jamie Collins, Marin Karen, Thick Molder, Danielle Kalaskis, Jagan is an Est, Julia Kyoto, Arvis, Bell Wenska, Gameboo, Firent, Cordelia Frey, Smaz Ruby, Saxon, Seraphew58, Reflect, Robin Cars That Drive, and Marin McLean. Editing Danny here, also going to thank Lilzabeth, who subscribed after I finished recording but right before I finished editing. Your support makes this possible. If any of you out there are interested in joining these lovely people, there is a link to my Patreon in the video description, but please only donate if you can comfortably afford to do so. Unlike Heroes, I don't want anyone going broke over Fire Emblem. While you're down there, liking and subscribing are free and they do help me out a ton, as well as helping YouTube know that you like this type of content so it gets fed to you by the algorithm more often. But regardless of what you end up doing, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.